Good evening, everybody, and welcome along to this edition of Heroes and Icons. My name is Pat Barry, and this is brought to you on Lair Media in association with Blue Sky Broadcasting and Media Services Limited. And the usual email info@lairmedia.tv if you want to make any comments. And this is our second edition of this program, and thank you to all the people who tuned in and watched our first edition on the wonderful Josephine Baker. We probably will do a part two of her life because we only have time to have a little sketch or a broad thumbnail of their life and times, if you follow my drift. Anyway, on this edition of Heroes and Icons, we're looking at the life and times of Geronimo, of the Native Americans. And indeed, today in America, there are only, I think, 5,000 Apaches alive in America today. And obviously an awful lot of that happened because of massacres and genocide and battles and all of that, which is historically recorded. I was wondering where I would begin in this show, because obviously we all know about who Geronimo was, or some of us may think, as I did myself, thought, who is this man? Or who was this man who died a prisoner as well of the United States of America? Anyway, there was a fantastic book written in 1970, which is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It is a book written from the perspective of the First Nation people, the Native Americans, and it is their account of their struggle to keep their land and their way of life, etc., broadly speaking, but it's also filled with joy, but it's filled with dreadful heartache and dreadful sorrow as well. And indeed, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, it relates about the massacre that occurred in Wounded Knee, which is in present-day South Dakota. And rather than listen to my words, I'm going to use some of the words of the author of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, but also we're going to relate some of the eyewitness accounts of what happened at Wounded Knee. Now, on the morning of December the 29th, this is 1890, I beg your pardon, and on December 29, 1890, US cavalry troops went into the camp to disarm the Lakota. Now, one version of the events claims that during the process of disarmament, of trying to disarm and ask the Indians to put down their arms, there was an Indian, an elder Indian by the name of Black Coyote, and he was reluctant to give up his rifle, saying that he had paid a lot of money for it. But obviously, he was deaf as well, or had very poor hearing. So he misunderstood or did not hear the order to put down your weapon. The Lakota warriors, of course, the two soldiers grabbed him from behind to take the rifle. In that process of doing that, the rifle discharged and all hell broke loose, and firing started. And obviously then some of the Lakota warriors that had concealed weapons in the encampment obviously ran for them, and hence was the beginning of the fight. Now, by the time the massacre at Wounded Knee was finished, over 300, they say, were dead. Most of them were women and children. And there was some 25 members of the cavalry of the soldiers lost their lives as well at Wounded Knee. Now, 20 soldiers from that battle were awarded the Medal of Honor. And indeed, and in 1990, at the centenary of the Wounded Knee massacre, both houses of the US Congress passed a resolution on the historical centenary, I suppose, formally expressing deep regret at the massacre. Now, I mean, obviously, some might say, well, better late than never, but really and truly, it is one of the many stains on the history. I suppose, look, we're not singling out any single country here on this show, but most countries would have their own tales to tell of things that happened during wars, and particularly during civil wars and all of that. Anyway, we have some eyewitness accounts which are recorded at the time, and some of these people lived right into the 20th century. And the first one we're going to read is from Thomas Tibbles. He was a journalist, and he passed away in 1928, which was a good bit after the massacre, which is 30 years or so. And he's a little thing, he said, "Suddenly I heard a single shot from the direction of the troops, then 3 or 4, and then a few more, and immediately a volley. At once came a general rattle of rifle firing, then the Hotchkiss guns. They were the guns that they had assembled around the camp itself. Now, a Dewey Beard, a Lakota survivor who lived up to 1955, and I suppose these eyewitness accounts were long and detailed. I'm not going to read all of them, the 2 details, to pick out the salient points that they were making. If you follow my drift, you can read all this in that excellent book, Bury My Heart in Wounded Knee. Then many Indians broke into the ravine. Some ran up the ravine and up to favorable positions where they could find safety, etc., like that, to hide. Black Elk, who was a medicine man, and an Oglala Lakota, and he lived up to 1950. I did not know how much was in it. When I look back now from the high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the Crooked Gulch, as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream, and I, to whom so great a vision was given in my youth, you see me now a pitiful old man who has done nothing, for the nation's hope is broken and scattered. There is no center any longer, and the sacred tree is dead. That was from Black Elk. American Horse, another Lakota. There was a woman with an infant in her arms who was killed as she almost touched the flag of truce. A mother was shot down with her child. The child, did not knowing that his mother was dead, was still nursing. The woman, as they were fleeing with their babies, were killed together, shot right through. And after most of all of them had been killed, a cry was made that all those who were not killed or wounded should come forth and they would be safe. Little boys came out of their places of refuge. As soon as they came in sight, a number of soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there. Another eyewitness is Edward S. Godfrey, Captain Commandant of D Company of the 7th Cavalry. I know the men did not aim deliberately, and they were greatly excited. These are trained soldiers now, hardened soldiers of the 7th Cavalry. And this is what a captain says on their behalf. I don't believe they saw their sights. They fired rapidly, but it seemed to me only a few seconds till there was not a living thing before us. Warriors, squaws, children, ponies, and dogs went down before the fire. That was a Captain Godfrey, and Hugh McGuinness of the 1st Battalion of K Company's 7th Cavalry. General Nelson A. Miles, who visited the scene of carnage following a 3-day blizzard, estimated that around 300 snow-shrouded forms were strewn over the countryside. He also discovered to his horror that helpless children and women with babies in their arms had been chased as far as 2 miles from the original scene of the encounter and cut down without mercy by the troopers. Judging by the slaughter on the battlefield, it was suggested that the soldiers simply went berserk. For who could explain such a merciless disregard for life? Well, there are many explanations. There's an obvious one. As I see it, to carry on Hugh McGuinness's account, as I see it, the battle was more or less a matter of spontaneous combustion sparked by mutual distrust, whatever that means. And then there was some Hugh McGuinness. And then the final eyewitness account, well, there are many, but these are just a sample of them. the Reverend Father Francis M.J. Craft, a Catholic missionary. The whole trouble originated through interested whites who had gone about most injustice and misrepresented the army and its movements upon all the agency. The troops acted with the greatest kindness and prudence. In the Wounded Knee fight, the Indians fired first. The troops fired only when compelled to. I was between both, saw it all, and know from an absolute knowledge of the whole affair, whereof I say, that was the Reverend Francis Craft, and another description of that comes to mind, but we'll be kind to history and these people who recorded what they saw. And heroes and icons is to show on their media, and I'll tell you, Geronimo is the figure we're going to look at tonight, and as you can see from his picture there, you know, when I look at these pictures, there's I see nobility. That's what I see in these First Nation people. I see nobility, and you might say that's a trite commenter, really, but I really do see nobility in these people. And having spoken to a few of them down through the years, there's a majesty, there's an inner spirituality that's attached to the First Nation people. That's just my opinion, for what it's worth. Now, the name Geronimo, of course, was born in 1829, the name Geronimo, there's many explanations for what his name means, but one of them is Goy Akala, which was his own name, or one who yawns. Now, that's a translation of one of the appellations of his name, but look, you can look that up yourself. Now, he was born in what today is known as New Mexico, the state of New Mexico. And there was regular conflict and fighting between the Mexicans and the Apaches. The Apache is a description of different little tribes, groups of tribes, and really we don't have time in this program to go into all of them, but suffice to say that there was continuous trouble between them, and mainly for land, for goods, for cattle, for horses. Then the Mexican government decided, look, we can't have this. They got very serious about them. So in 1851, during one of those raids, around 400 Mexican soldiers were sent in to ambush Apaches who were coming over the border, crossing over on their raiding parties. And they came across an encampment in Bedocone, Bedoncone, where Geronimo's encampment, but they were gone off in a raiding party. When Geronimo returned in the evening, he found that his mother, his wife, and his 3 small children were among the people who had been murdered, because it was mainly old men and women and children, because all the lads had gone off, all the men had gone off in a raiding party. And when you consider the struggle that he had from that happened, and he was only just 22 at the time, he married with 3 children, and he spent the next 23 of his years of his life as a prisoner of war of the United States of America. And really, when he passed away in 1909 in Fort Sill in Oklahoma, it wasn't till 4 years later, in 1913, that they left the rest of the Apaches free, that is the United States government. Now, from the picture you can see there, some of the pictures we're putting up as I'm speaking, you can see the majesty of the different Native Americans in their different formats. They're eating and hunting and usually socializing as well. And you can see a collective picture. When I mention names like Geronimo, Chief Joseph, Black Hawk, Sitting Bull, Spotted Elk, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, etc. All these are familiar names of heroes and icons, which is what we're covering here. Now, obviously, generally speaking, history is written by the victors. And we have that in our own country as well as in many other countries. And sometimes the other side, the other story gets lost. But in this remove, we have plenty. Now, Geronimo spent nearly all his adult life fighting, moving from one place to another, surrendering at different times. And indeed, I suppose you cannot displace one Indian chief or leader from another because they all fought together at one time, particularly in 1876 at Little Bighorn, the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. It wasn't one big battle, as we know, it was three different coming together of different groups because Custer had divided his troops into three parts. He divided them into trees, and obviously his would be one that is the most of the films were made about George Armstrong Custer, and I think my favorite film on that time was Robert Shaw. I think played him in the film, and I thought he was magnificent. But really, obviously, that was a big defeat for the U.S. cavalry and soldiers and the United States as well. You know, they had some victories. I'm just reading a bit about Bighorn today. There was quite a few Irishmen of Irish descent there, and one of them I came across was a John Barry from Waterford. He was a soldier with 7th Cavalry, and he died at the Little Bighorn, as of course Miles Keogh from Carlow. But we'll do something on those some other time. But suffice to say that this whole issue of the First Nation, the Native Americans, is still to this day something that is not quite settled, for the want of a better description. And you can read an awful lot about them in those books. But I would, if you want to have a good beginning for understanding First Nation people, Native Americans, I think that book, Bury My Heart in Wounded Knee, is a good starting point. I've read it 3 times myself. Now, the speech of Chief Joseph is etched in the annals of American history. He spoke against the US injustice and discrimination against Native Americans. In 1904, he died, and according to his doctor, he died of a broken heart. Now, not many doctors would go on a limb and say that, but you can understand it in 1904 because the case and the situation of the Native Americans was one of, I suppose, being landless, being without their place, without their open spaces, without their land, which was in many cases, they were tricked out of it, they were robbed out of it as well, and they were misled of signing the different treaties. And as you know, most of those treaties, if not all of them, were broken, you know. And I suppose, looking back on it now, there are many films, of course, made as well. The old Western films depicted the First Nation people as savages, uncivilized, brutal. In the old Hollywood. Hollywood has a lot to answer to in depicting Native Americans in that regard, which was a shocking indictment. I think those old Westerns would depict those Indians as savage people. I think none of them should be allowed to be shown today now because they are just prolonging the misery and the hurt and the insult to, as I said, a noble people. Now, in the years leading up to the conflict that's at Wounded Knee, the US government continued to seize Lakota lands, and the once large bison herds, which I suppose to say, you must remember, of course, bison were very important to the Native Americans, not alone to eat, obviously, and to sustain them, but to make every single part of the bison was used by the Native American. What I mean by that is their skins, their pelts, made their tepees, made their clothes, and etc. So there was no waste. They were, you know, really, really in tune with nature and with the land they lived on. And the bison herds, they were a staple of the Great Plains people, had been hunted to almost near extinction. Treaty promises to protect reservation lands from encroachment by settlers and gold miners were not implemented as agreed. And as a result, there was complete and unrest, and I suppose suspicion on both sides, was certainly on the sides of the Native American. Now, there was a movement started called the Ghost Dance Movement, and that was something that the government of the United States, they tried to arrest as many people, and that's how Crazy Horse got killed. You know, he was murdered in a fort, you know, when he was being taken prisoner, and which was another, and nobody held accountable for it, which was two wrongs, one wrong on top of another. As you can see from my backdrop, there are some early photographs of the Native Americans, but we will put the links up to some of the things I've mentioned on my page on this edition of Heroes and Icons. And you can find all our programs on our YouTube channel and on learmedia.tv. And we have an email, info@learmedia.tv as well, you know. And the Ghost Dance movement, I suppose, came about as a result of a slow but ever-present destruction of Native American way of life. Tribal land was being seized at alarming rates, and the once great bison herds were almost wiped out. The Plains tribes' entire way of life revolved around the bison, and without them, Native American tribes rapidly lost stability. The Ghost Dance brought hope. The white man would soon disappear. The buffalo herds would return. People would be reunited with loved ones who had since passed away. The old way of living before the white man would return. That was the hope of the dance. This was not just a religious movement, but a response to the gradual cultural destruction of their way of life. And obviously, it was seen, simplistic term, by the US government as a threat to them, to the stability of the country. So that's how those things came about, and there was huge mistrust as well. But I mean, Geronimo himself, as I said, Geronimo passed away still a prisoner of the United States government in Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1909. We did, for this program before, we did try to make contact with one or two of his ancestors, but we had no success before we aired this. But hopefully down the line, we will get to speak with them and get to speak with some Native Americans as well. I feel it's a story, as I said, I'm a firm believer in Indigenous people. Of course, there is a connection with the Republic of Ireland and the Lakota, the Apache, who sent over some money to help the Irish during the Great Famine in 1845. And there's a wonderful monument up to them outside Middleton in County Cork. Beautiful. The Choctaw Nation, I beg your pardon, sent over some money to help us in our, I suppose, dreadful times. And indeed, if anybody could sympathize with the Irish that time, no doubt the Native American Indians were indeed very much to the fore in that, and we thank them for that. And it is very much appreciated. There's been strong ties between them down through the years. But anyway, for this edition, and for this edition of Heroes and Icons, on the thumbnail of Geronimo, wonderful noble warrior, as you can see there by some of the photographs of himself and his family down through the years. We want to thank you for listening, and continue listening and looking at our shows up on our YouTube channel, and you can catch them all on that. And we will be in a position in a few weeks' time to put our shows out live on our webpage, but more about that and on. So for this edition of Heroes and Icons, hope you enjoyed it. For myself, Pat Barry, goodbye now until we meet again, and good luck.